because of that leaf blowing guy, not quite sure how to proceed. My preference would be to sit and talk if you can all hear me comfortably. You can. Otherwise, I'll stand. And if that gets too annoying to you or me, in the next few minutes, I'll grab the podium and stand and talk. The reason I want to sit rather than stand is because this is really a reflection, and it's a reflection on what I call the Hope Project, which goes all the way back to my beginnings here at Wayne State. And since I feel at home, and this is a comfortable place for me, I want to sort of speak among friends. I want to talk about the first question of my first book, my second book, I'm sorry, which was, the book opens with, "Is there reason to hope today?" as the question, which was a strange question. The book was published 35 years ago. It's a strange question because I asked the question in light of two very momentous events. One was personal, the other was world historical. I was unemployed at Wayne State University in January 1975. That is to say, I was between working here and a grievance process since I had been turned down for tenure as probably among the first of the New Left professors to come up for tenure. And that grievance process only happened because we had collective bargaining at Wayne State, a faculty union. And I won the grievance process and returned triumphant to the university with a tenured position. So that was January 1975. And 3 months later, the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong swept into Saigon, ending the American presence there, as well as the regime the United States had imposed on South Vietnam 20 years before that. So the radical professor had survived, and the war was over. What could be more hopeful? And yet, I found myself asking the question about hope, despite these two New Left reasons to celebrate, because all around me, the New Left was fading. It was losing people, it was fragmenting, it was becoming dispirited. From civil rights to the student and anti-war movements, Black power and women's liberation, all were accompanied by new attitudes, new values, a cultural revolution, we like to think. Our activism, we felt, had brought hope to millions of people. This was a diverse, loosely connected wave, and it had generated a mood of possibility and agency. We thought we were making the U.S. and the world more equal, more democratic, and more peaceful. It was really dizzying to come of age with this sense of hope. But at the moment of triumph, for some reason, it now seemed to be fading. So I had this contradictory sense that I had won the battle of my life. We now had peace in Vietnam, and yet where was the movement? At the same time, what was called the oil shock of 1973 had been followed by a stock market crash and the end of the post-World War II economic boom. We didn't know that the boom was over at the time, but as it turned out, that's what happened. So one result that we were aware of was that environmental damage was growing and ecological limits to human growth were beginning to impose themselves. Captured by Robert Heilbroner's book, The Human Prospect. So I, as a just tenured New Left professor, took up the challenge posed by what was really an atmosphere of discouragement and an atmosphere of doubt. I was quickly drawn from those immediate issues to some deeper historical reasons, which must have been rumbling around inside me. On many of our minds, of course, was the Vietnam War and the spiral of death that the United States had so ruthlessly imposed on it. And at the same time, I was trying to understand the catastrophes unleashed by Nazism and Stalinism, as well as the threat of nuclear war that was beginning to revive under Ronald Reagan. Indeed, by the end of the 20th century, it seemed as if the shadow of death of 100 million people killed by war, starvation, the byproducts of war during the century, bombed, starved, gassed, destroyed by famine and disease, that shadow of 100 million people killed made the century, famously a century of technology and of revolution, was also a century of organized murder. So I, probably because I had won these battles and was part of the movement that helped stop the war in Vietnam, I felt very positive about approaching the negative. So I started wandering through what some authors called the valley of death of the 20th century. And I started trying to describe the processes of impotence, power, social madness, and mass murder that characterized the 20th century. By what logic, to take one question, did the Marxist project, which I felt connected to, of overthrowing capitalism and creating a democratic and equal society of plenty, why did that in the Soviet Union lead to purges, famine, the Gulag, and the Stalinist totalitarianism? So I was asking about what apparently were irrationalities that explain specific paroxysms, terror and destruction. Germany, the Soviet Union, and even the United States and Vietnam. And I wondered how it was possible to sustain hope for a better world in the face of such catastrophes. Is hope no more than a desperate assertion against the modern world's main trends? Is it a religious attitude? So I asked these questions in the conclusion to my preface to Hope. That's what the Dialectics of Disaster, published by Verso in 1980, was subtitled. I stressed not only social irrationality and disillusionment with progress, but also the irreducible determination to survive and resist and keep creating movements against war and oppression. After Auschwitz, after the 20th century, hope had to be in spite of danger, loss, even disaster. But then what about progress? Postmodernists dismissed it out of hand as an obsolete grand narrative. But I thought it would be better to study the idea of progress from its beginnings and see where it went wrong, as well as to try to disentangle the realities of technical and human progress, because it was undeniable, from the drive for profit, the capitalist system. So my first steps were in articles entitled After Progress and the Holocaust and Human Progress. And these articles focused on such thinkers as Horkheimer, Adorno, and Marcuse, and their parallel yet conflicting interpretations of Nazism as a product of progress, because that's how some of the writers talked about it. Adorno, most despairingly, rejected any thought of a plan for a better world being inscribed in history. Rather, he said, if there's a logic in history, it's I'll quote him, no universal history leads from savagery to humanitarianism, progress, but there is one leading from the slingshot to the megaton bomb. Negative progress, in other words, things getting more desperately destructive. Now, my teacher, Marcuse, was determined to explore the most negative trends of Western history, but without denying the potential for liberation. He was trying to see how it's possible to create a better world on the one hand, alongside the threat of total destruction on the other. I had been shaped by him since he was my teacher. negativity and hope. So it seemed to me that if hope for a better world is to be more than potty idealism, you had to take the full measure of negativity. So realism looking at both directions. Realism looking at how positive things might be and positive changes in human history, and realism looking at negativity, how bad things could be and how bad things had sometimes been. And with these attitudes in mind, I approached South Africa and apartheid and participated in the struggle against apartheid as a visiting lecturer in South Africa in 1987. I went back in 1990 and then again in 2002. So I used my way of thinking about things to analyze South Africa. In a memorial lecture remembering an assassinated colleague, he had been assassinated by an Afrikaner partisan in the very university where I was lecturing. And I was, to be sure, probably speaking under surveillance, as any semi-public and any classroom situation was in South Africa during this state of emergency. People were being rounded up, put in detention, staying in detention for months to a year. I recall some of my lectures, someone who just got out of jail and a year of being, non-functioning in the world, but detained, coming to the lecture and participating. I wondered whether the country's white rulers might be heading towards disaster by refusing to give up their commitment to minority rule, which was becoming ever more irrational. Not only detentions, there were township uprisings, massive dissent at the university, demonstrations constantly, foreign boycotts. All of this was happening despite the behind-the-scenes contact between the government and the African National Congress. So there was an ongoing state of emergency and a stalemate between the apartheid regime and the opposition. Surely, the white minority government couldn't forever repress the vast majority. I tried to take a world historical view on this. The non-racial movement of the vast majority belonged to a worldwide current of struggle for equality, dignity, and human rights. They had been moved, inspired by the civil rights movement in the United States. They listened to and spoke, quoted the United Nations various documents on human rights. They weren't about to give up the struggle, even when the government made some concessions. For example, desegregating buses. People in the movement felt, they're not going to shut us up. This shows how powerful we are, and we're going to stay in the struggle. So all over South Africa, this movement continued. It simply wouldn't be brought to heel, even though the president of South Africa bragged about how much power he still had that he hadn't used yet. These human beings knew that if they held out, they could not be defeated. What would happen wasn't clear. But what happened was not going to be, it turns out, the land of milk and honey. Yes, there's majority rule in South Africa. Many activists dreamed about it. They also dreamed about, many of them had dreamed about socialism coming to South Africa. Many of them hoped that, of course, the transformation would bring an end to racial thinking in South Africa. But there was a problem, which was since the foreign communist allies collapsed, the Soviet Union collapsed, and the support coming from Soviet allied countries collapsed between 1989 and 1991, the International Monetary Fund was going to be unopposed in setting the terms of the post-apartheid society. Whites were not about to relinquish their economic and social power, which meant that vigorous efforts to uplift the impoverished minority were simply not going to be on the agenda. Still, The end of apartheid would mean, at the very least, the end of a racial state in dozens of ways. Legal discrimination would end, and affirmative action would become an official theme of the new government. At the same time, to quote the title of one book, the vast majority of South Africans would be shortchanged by the end of apartheid, and they would remain in poverty right into the present. So disillusionment with political activism, disillusionment with this mass movement, which had been in some ways successful, was inevitable. Post-apartheid South Africa failed to equal the hopes of those who struggled and sacrificed to bring it about. But my question was, and still is, are such hopes ever met? Even after victory, in the most radical terms, there's still only partial gains, limited results, defeats within victories, achievements that are reversed, betrayals, even sometimes catastrophic outcomes. This is the stuff of real history, just as is courageous movements battling against oppression. So the highest of hopes, it seemed to me, inevitably enter into every movement. That's happening today. The highest of hopes enter into movements, and hope always revives even after being defeated by reality. And large goals, for example, goals of male-female equality, black-white equality, an end to foreign rule, democratic government, union recognition, an end to foreign rule, controlling climate change, resisting neoliberalism, winning a living wage. Any of these struggles that people involve themselves evoke naturally the highest hopes, the sense of a better world for all of us. And why does that happen? Because people live through the experience of acting with others, they live through the experience of collective power, and they live through the experience then of solidarity. They live through the experience of being inspired by others elsewhere and their achievements, and placing themselves in a wider history of social and moral progress. Any strike, any demonstration evokes this kind of hope. And this kind of hope gets codified, for example, in documents like the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And they enter into the persona and the words and and individuals like Martin Luther King and Nelson Mandela. Such grand hopes are inevitably disillusioned, but they're not false. These aspirations have their own truth, not because they foreshadow the future or because they're actual historical trends moving on their own towards fulfillment, but they express our deeper needs and our deeper longings, which are contained in every social movement, demanding freedom and justice. Solidarity eventually fades because life isn't like that. Daily life resumes, reality sets in. But for a moment in any movement of struggle, we've tasted something well beyond daily life, living a sense of justice, experiencing ourselves as fully moral, and feeling fully who we are and who we want to become. Think about a social movement. This is a social movement. Well, think about a social movement for a moment. It exists in order to bring about certain changes, and in the process of participating or identify with it, we change in both our being and our perception. This is what you would have to call an ontological and an epistemological transformation. We move from isolation to a sense of collectivity. We become members of a larger entity. We draw power from that, we have responsibility to it, and we experience ourselves within it. Our active collective stance generates a sense that it's possible to alter social reality, and so recast situations and relationships that seem fixed and blocked. The very existence of this we overcomes the passivity in which we find ourselves before we bring it into being. By contesting existing social structures and practices, the we demands that things be more fair, more humane, more equal, more democratic. We thus challenge the dominant system of power, those who benefit from it and those who control it. In so acting, we sense the possibility that things might be different, and we experience our own power to make this so. Self-empowered, we willingly contest those in power. Solidarity, each for each other, all for each for all, replaces individual self-seeking as our social norm. And we draw upon and contribute to a new current of aspirations and morality. This can eventually become much wider than our own we, can be seen to stretch back in time and shape our present, as well as proposing a better future for everyone. We find our own individual identity drawing from that kind of movement of history. In creating ourselves as a movement, then, we create hope. This is a remarkable change in our being. Even if it's momentary or brief, it's accompanied by a no less remarkable change in our perception. By becoming collective actors opposing ourselves to other actors, we look for their weaknesses and their resistances, as well as our own strengths and the objective possibilities of change. The once fixed and frozen field before us becomes redefined as our practical one. And once we become active agents, our adversaries lose their apparent invincibility, their quality of givenness. We analyze them in terms of their purposes, their strengths, their vulnerabilities. The complex historical and social field is no longer simply an immovable fact of life, but now becomes a series of guides and obstacles. Once viewed as an individual, a passive individual, what are formerly overwhelming forces now become antagonists to be overcome or circumvented. Once fixed situations become experienced as fluid and subject to change. This may be a psychological change, but this change is how we see. Its change in how we see is also a change in what we see. In the Warsaw Ghetto in spring of 1943, the absolutely hopelessly outnumbered and hopelessly outgunned resistance united actively against the overwhelming Nazi forces and fought them almost to a standstill for 2 or 3 weeks, and transformed a hopeless situation of simply being passive objects to be brought to Auschwitz and gassed, transformed themselves into a fighting unit. And they fought and they didn't win, but they scored and they scored and they became different people. Now you can say it was hopeless and they were outnumbered from the beginning. True. But on the other hand, the story of the Warsaw Ghetto found its way to other camps, to other ghettos during that year, 1943, and encouraged others, such as at Treblinka, to resist the Nazis, and in some cases, overcome them and burn down the camps and escape into the forest. These are true stories, but they also became myths. And they became myths of resistance that empowered other people. Now I'm taking the most hopeless situation and saying, in that hopeless situation, people did something that generated and encouraged hope. The same thing happens in the anti-Trump resistance. The same thing happens in union organizing movements. The same thing happens among the women who are beginning to resist predatory males. What is unstoppable and unchangeable, once a movement develops, suddenly becomes something to be fought against, and that's what's happening now. The way things are turns out to be humanly created, and we look for ways to change it. Now, this is obviously a short-lived experience, and I'm suggesting that even though after the experience is over and people become bitter that we lost or we only changed a small amount, and they search for scapegoats and they start blaming each other as the movement fails or wanes, something else is happening, has happened, something beyond limited objectives. A deep desire suddenly surfaces, the longing for something different, implying a better world. And that world briefly comes alive among the women who are, for example, encouraging each other and deciding to speak out. Paradoxically, then, the better world is born in communities of struggle. The kind of hope that matters most is collective action, aiming at changing the social and political world. Now, notice I'm talking about something collective, not individual. And it is both a subjective force, a mood, a feeling, but also an objective force, a way of changing and acting on the world. These were my conclusions about hope after the Holocaust and communism, after Marxism, after progress. But in some way, some of this gets evoked by Barack Obama's "Yes, We Can," which managed to create both a sense of a movement-style campaign and the power to achieve what had been unthinkable and to reverse a key fact of American history. Both a sense of the limits and a sense of a large-scale hope that is evoked, as you know from the Hope poster, the multicolored Obama poster that characterized the election, 9 years ago, 10 years ago. That poster was brilliant political advertising. Obama, hope, multicolors. But it also suggests the historical breakthrough of a man who had thought about hope, who had written about hope, and who was trying to implement a new kind of hope in American politics. The Hope campaign of 2008 came about at a time when hope itself, as a social reality in US politics, was being transformed. I describe that in my book, We. Actually, why don't we just pass that around? Look at it.
We don't have to buy it, do we?
That's required.
Okay. I bought my money.
I'm just bringing money. The change that hope was undergoing, which I talk about in the book, was very simple. Social hope, the hope that matters for making a better world, is being privatized. And this has been going on for a generation. What I mean is that personal expectations have increasingly been detached from the wider world. My hope is increasingly separated from a sense of creating a better society or being in a better society. This is one of the poison fruits of neoliberalism. We've been taught, in Margaret Thatcher's words, that there is no such thing as society, only individuals. As sociologist Ulrich Beck described it, in the risk society, that's what we live in, he says, individuals are increasingly charged with, listen to this, finding biographical solutions to systemic contradictions. Finding biographical solutions. In other words, there are social contradictions, there are all sorts of systemic problems, and you are charged, we are all charged with finding personal solutions. Individuals are shaped to be entrepreneurial and self-seeking, and we're left alone to confront the maelstrom of the market economy, which is a planned maelstrom. Nobody is supposed to be able to control it. I'll give you one example which is especially telling in Detroit. The growth of charter schools, which have virtually destroyed the public school system of Detroit as an alternative to public schools, is posing everybody looking on their own for the best deal they can get for themselves, and to hell with the social reality of a public school system. The goals of education have changed. They once included the development of intellect and the capacity for citizenship, and today, anybody who knows about, has children, grandchildren in school knows there's an ever-growing obsession with positioning and marketing oneself. Social hope is giving way to individual self-pursuit. And so we learn to be cynical. We are taught to be cynical about any effort by governments, movements, to shape the world beyond ourselves. We become helpless before, I'll use a technical term, analyzed by philosopher Harry Frankfurt, we're helpless before the bullshit of the society in which marketing is everywhere all the time. Bullshit as a primary technical term to analyze what's going on today when each of us is being sold constantly. These are some of the main themes of my book. And by the 2016 election, it was clear that social hope, meaning social hope, was in trouble. The first chapter in the book is called Hope in Trouble. As I wrote in The Nation during the election process, for a moment during the campaign, it seemed that the process of privatization was being rejected by both of the insurgent candidates, Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump. Sanders built his campaign around social solutions to social problems. And Trump, too, for a minute, seemed to reject the smug neoliberalism of the other 16 Republicans, demanding vigorous government action. But while the old socialist, Sanders, was reviving an almost forgotten sense of social hope, as did Jeremy Corbyn in Britain, Trump was the one who wound up in power, combining nasty racial and nationalistic appeals with radical free market neoliberalism of his cronies that he brought into power with him from a certain part of the capitalist world, especially the financial and extractive sectors that produce nothing of social value. Now, you might ask, well, no, actually I'll save the question for when I'm done. Isn't Trump also leader of a hopeful movement? Let me just sort of simply make my point, or assert my point, that there's something in the Trump movement that is vicious, vile, and authoritarian, and anti-hope. Much more like the fascist movements of the last 100 years than the hopeful movements of the left that I'm talking about. But once in office, Trump was met with a massive and spontaneous uprising. We know the story of the movement, calling itself the Resistance. It willed itself into existence. It was determined to do battle on virtually every front. And any post-election discouragement, which was enormous, was sloughed off immediately and replaced within days by one of the largest organized movements in American history. The former Democratic staffers developed the Indivisible Document and focused on, well, think about what Indivisible focuses on: preserving the status quo. It's not consciously a progressive movement looking for change. But even so, the Republican attack on Obamacare was so flagrantly partisan and incompetent that a simple solution to the Republican healthcare mess began to appear: single payer. The progressive change welled up among people who only wanted to stop Trump. So when Bernie Sanders introduced the bill in the Senate this fall, he did so with 16 co-sponsors. Clearly, their energy is building up in many directions at once. And it has become, despite its real conservative effort to fight against Trump, it's become progressive in new ways. Solidarity with immigrants comes from and further generates a wider sense of solidarity. Protecting the defective healthcare system encourages thinking about a better healthcare system. opposition to white racism promotes a wider sense of brother and sisterhood. The higher profile assumed by women's activism in the face of Trump's misogyny generates the confidence to expose male predators. Structures and acts of resistance generate and benefit from a growing experience of social hope. People are starting to connect the dots between Trump's actions and the system that created him. There's a broad understanding growing about something called Trumpism, and even that it is the latest stage of capitalism. The understanding is spreading that he is the product and expression of contemporary American society, including the ways in which Democrats have become complicit in its most essential features. He succeeded in uniting right-wing evangelical Christians, working-class Democrats, Tea Party supporters, climate change deniers and their corporate forces, and extreme free market Republicans and their corporate backers. Among his base are many motivated by resentment against the social changes of the past generations, advances by African Americans, women, and gays, as well as the increasingly multicultural nature of American society. Trump told his white Christian supporters, "This is our last chance to turn things around." And he would do so. How? By building a wall, by stopping immigration. So what all this means is that talking about social hope in the time of Trump takes us beyond this philosophical and historical reflection, takes us beyond charting trends, positive and negative trends, and into fierce struggle. Thinking about hope today demands registering the we that is coming into being and becoming part of it. Perhaps the most important lesson, to conclude, of my Hope Project is that hope isn't just a given, but it has to be created and recreated. And sometimes, in the most extreme circumstances, in the face of a galvanizing danger. Today, Trumpism is the galvanizing danger. Thank you. Questions, comments, thoughts? Josh?
You're quite aware of my more hardline Marxist interpretation of hope and whatnot, but first of all, really like the discussion. Part of the problem that I have with kind of abstracting hope in such a manner is a little bit like what you're saying, that hope can be individualized. Whether or not it should or shouldn't is, kind of a question we can ask for ourselves. But I've always seen hope as bifurcated down like two paths, and I'll use pop culture to explain it. There's kind of like the Star Wars interpretation of hope, and then there's the Hunger Games interpretation of hope. In Star Wars, they have, action that catalyzes from one individual, but then it creates hope and then fosters the progression of rebellion, this huge movement against power. And then in the Hunger Games, there's like this quote from the bad guy, I don't remember his name or whatever, where he says, hope is how we keep people in line. Like, if we really wanted to just round people up, if we wanted to just force them to do what we want, why don't we just round them up and shoot them every single year? Like, why do we do this whole game thing? Why is there like a lottery? And he says it's because of hope. Hope is what keeps them passive. Hope is what keeps them from getting up and doing anything. So, in other words, you have these two natures of hope. Hope that can be oppressive and hope that can be liberating. And I guess, like, where would you draw the line,
Sure.
or how would you see in the current movement?
Yeah, I would look at those two as follows. One, the first kind of hope is the kind of collective social hope in which people experience themselves with other people in struggle. And that process creates a sense not only of we, but generally a democratic sense, a sense of empowerment, of individuals empowered to a larger group, a sense of being able to change reality. That's the kind of social hope that I'm talking about in the book as being reborn. The book is entitled Reviving Social Hope. And the question is, how is it possible to revive social hope? Well, it's possible despite all the negative trends. Despite all the negative trends, including the whole second type of hope you're talking about, which is the negative trend. Because it's fragmenting people, it's separating them, it's isolating them, and the hope is administered from the outside, not self-created, and people are individualized in that hope, and they're impotent. But it's also the kind of hope that Trump brings. Trump brings that hope as the great leader. Remember, he said, I will fix things. And it's a hope in which he aims certain people at other people. It's filled with hatred, hostility, and nostalgia. It's the authoritarian, fascist-toned hope of, of the last 100 years. And I call that anti-hope. I also call that the distorting mirror, the funhouse mirror hope. Someone calls it hope, you look at it, but it's not true. It's not really hope. And the words here are part of the manipulation. Because he's going to fix things, and we're impotent, and we're former union members in a deindustrialized place, and I vote for him passively. I go to rallies, and I vent my hatred at minorities, black people, Muslims, women, and so on. So that's exactly, you've sort of laid out the scenario I discussed in the book. And I said earlier I was going to talk about the Trump anti-hope, the funhouse mirror hope, and you gave me the opportunity to do it. But because the book has a chapter 1 begins Hope and Trouble. Chapter 2 is what hope is. What hope is that collective movement, left-leaning process in which we feel empowered and we think collectively and democratically, and we seek to change the world in a positive direction. And much of the history of the modern world has been about that. Much of the history. There is a history, broadly speaking, of the left, which is the history of Enlightenment hopes. And we join that by becoming part of the resistance, union movements, and so on. To join Trump's pseudo-hope, funhouse mirror hope, is to remain passive, negative, hateful, and ultimately disappointed because Trump stirred that up in people. But who's really governing? What's really happening here? What's really happening is he's giving power to the extreme right neoliberals who want to dismantle government, who want to sharpen the distance between the top and the bottom. That's another anti-hope reality. It's a con game, it's a shell game, it's the American tradition of the person out there selling liniments that will cure our troubles. And that's, you can stir up people's hopes that way, but it's bullshit.
Yeah, I've heard a lot of people kind of put Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump in the same bag and say, they're both populists, and even sometimes they are both referred to as extremists. And I see Bernie Sanders, some of his domestic policies are pretty much mainstream in Europe. They're not really radical. And then Donald Trump, it's hard to know what his policies really are, and also it's like you said, he's just a strong man, he's going to take care of everything. But what I'm wondering, you talked about how people are transformed when they're involved in a movement. What would you think about the people that have been involved recently in supporting Bernie Sanders or the women's movement? How would you place that, like, in the context of the labor union movement and others, in terms of how long-lasting you think it might be and how substantive it is now? Is it just a temporary reaction, or do you think it's going to really grow into something more solid?
Well, I didn't get a chance to really developed this point enough. But I think the form of the resistance is that movement form that generates hope, not even necessarily by its goals, because its goals are very restrained, but by its processes. People becoming part of groups, going to meetings, talking about things. I was, for example, at a meeting last night. There were maybe 14 women and 2 men, which is typical of the resistance in particularly the indivisible groups. There are some 7,000 groups formed, self-formed, to call out, put pressure on, lobby members of Congress. And it's a very restrained, restricted goal on the one hand. On the other hand, those people meet regularly. These women and 2 men meet regularly. They discuss politics. They're engaged. They feel responsible to each other. They make decisions about what to do. They're not passive. They're not isolated. They are angry, but they're angry active. And I think they have a tremendous sense of hope because they have a mission and they're carrying it out. I don't really care, as someone from the left, I don't really care whether that movement poses single-payer health care, which is, of course, the only solution to the problem we have. I don't care if it poses that or not right now, because I think what that movement is getting is a sense of power, a sense of clarity, a willingness to understand and think and read. They're going to meetings. Speakers are talking about different dimensions of Trump's policies. Something is happening in that process, and I want to talk about creating hope, not as this is not a substantive. This is an abstract way of understanding a process, but an absolutely necessary one. And people are doing something. In the end, what does hope boil down to? It boils down to acting. It boils down to acting collectively in different circumstances at different times. There are other forms of hope historically where people ask the question, what's happening with the world? Are things getting better? Should I be hopeful about where things are going? And notice the passivity and detachment in that. But the kind of movement hope I'm talking about, which has been transforming the world in the past, for the last 300 years, that kind of movement hope is always active, energetic, democratic, and I think that's where hope lies. Whereas Trump is keeping people, I want to say, isolated, separated, passive, and rooting in hostility to other people.
Any more questions? I have one.
Yes, Jose.
Are we at, or have we begun the process of kind of reconceptualizing the whole system? I mean, why do people need to have social movements that have hope? There's an oppressive system that provokes them into resistance that gives them hope. So
And you just said that gives them hope. Exactly.
So the resistance gives them hope, but what is the system, because we're talking about the evolution of human civilization and where we find ourselves, and you said it right there, that we're in a state of global ecological crises, we're in a state of economic crises, social crises. I would venture to say that many of the suicides that are happening right now through opioids and other means, guns, are a symptom of the loss of hope by at least part of the population. So do we need, maybe the better way to phrase it, do we need more words, a new vocabulary to describe what's going on? Do we need to sharpen our concepts?
I don't know. I mean, I think, you wanted, at the beginning, it sounded like you were ushering hope out the front door, but as you talked, you brought it in the back. And it became very important to what you were saying, because people create hope. And they create hope. What is hope? Hope is a collective sense of being able to make a difference in line with deep needs and quote-unquote ideals. It's a meaningful phenomenon, and people regenerate it in all sorts of situations. I'm not interested in the abstraction. I'm interested in concretely what has happened to it. What was it? At a certain point, you need to compare what I'm talking about with the idea of progress. The idea of progress with a capital P is something is moving on its own, right? Something is moving, is making the world better. We're not sure what it is. I think it was a mystified form of God who got ushered out the front door and was being brought back in the back door, that this is making the world better. Well, come on, really. You have to analyze whatever progress breaks down into a number of things. But to talk about it as a force operating on its own was always totally mistaken. Same thing about hope. Hope is not a force moving on its own. It is people acting together and generating, and anyone who has been involved in a movement here has had that experience. And you know what the experience is, you know how short-lived it can be, and you know how important it is, and how nourishing it can be for collective action, and how it transforms the way one thinks and sees. Because you move from being an isolated, collective, passive individual to being a part of something larger, in which you feel like you can see yourself, and yet you feel empowered by acting collectively, and you feel you can make a difference, and you are making a difference in a positive and generally beneficial for everybody direction. That's hope. I don't want to lift it out of there now and talk about it as some sort of substantive that's moving by itself. It's not. Hope can be utterly destroyed at a given moment.
Over here.
I'm taking notes and I'm listening, and I almost got the implication that more people collecting guns, that is their, I could be wrong here, they're a kind of form of hope, and they're Trump supporters, and they hear the promises, but they feel they have a more hopeful circumstance if they have guns. Am I really
That's good.
out in orbit?
No, that's to me, that's the funhouse mirror fake hope, because people are trying to protect themselves. They're trying to protect themselves. They feel desperate, they feel threatened. Now, if you want to call that hope, you can, but I want to define hope so that it has a very concrete, specific historical meaning. And I want to say, whatever people are doing, there's something, I want to talk about that as anti-hope. There's some desperation in it, and concern for survival, separate from other people. And if I'm buying a gun and learning how to use the gun as my mode of ensuring my well-being, it's fairly sick, and it departs radically from the kind of social process that I think meaningful hope, social hope as I describe it, has been. Now, you can talk about dozens of kinds of hope, I suppose, and I think you can accuse me of focusing on a single kind. Correct. Social hope, modern progressive social hope. Yes, I accept the accusation. And I want to say there are other forms of hope. There's hope for an afterlife. Okay, that's a different thing. There's the hope, what else? Well, hope for
For a happy marriage.
Hope, yeah, hope for a happy marriage is, see, I want to always say, I want to always insist, hope is action. And without action, I want to say, hope means nothing. It dissolves into something else. It dissolves. I want to talk about hope as active, energetic, capable, and assertive. That's the kind of hope I want to describe. And I want to say, movements can be defeated and utterly lose hope. There was, after the election, in, November the 9th, shortly after, a cartoon made the rounds on the internet, I guess on Facebook, by a man named Gustavo Wieselner, an artist. And I probably have it somewhere in here. The panel one, Barack and Michelle Obama are getting ready to leave the White House. They're moving around, they're picking up their stuff. Now we've got them moving boxes out. Now we've got them, several panels here. We've got finally one rollerboard being pulled out by Barack. Ready, Michelle? Yes. And then the next panel, third to the end, no, the second to the end, Obama's finger is on the light switch and he turns out the lights. Next panel, White House goes dark. Next panel, America goes dark. That was an experience people had of a complete loss of hope at the end of the election. It was a momentary experience because soon after, for example, in my neighborhood, a meeting of normally 20 people was convened, and the 20 people who showed up to discuss the election were actually 60 people. Something happened. 3 times as many people showed up. Then a follow-up meeting happened, and 100 people showed up. And those 100 people organized themselves into indivisible groups to carry out this progressive lobbying effort on Congress. So what's happened is the loss of hope, which for moments completely dissolved, rebuilt itself as people decided to do what? To become active again. And that's what's happening right now against Trump and Trumpism.
Final question.
Let's say the Trump people are collecting more guns. Subconsciously, does that mean they don't think he's
That's right.
going to
That's
come
exactly.
through with his promises? If you don't see any changes around you in your neighborhood, whatever, say, subconsciously they are worried he's not doing a good job, but they don't realize that, so they buy more guns.
Thank
He's
you.
not going to do it.
That's my best.
They still support him. They, you have all those voters that voted for him that are still in the same position that they were this past decade or however long, and they still support him 100%.
They support him 100%, but they're buying guns. I think you're absolutely right. I think there's a sense of nostalgia, wanting to get back to the past, and a sense of despair about being able to do it, and a sense of collective social impotence. I have to protect myself because there is no sense of we that can make a better situation. So I think you're absolutely right. I've got to remember that point.
They also have a common enemy with Trump. They are his troops, and they have the guns to carry out his mission. So you can see it both ways. They're desperate. They're not going to trust any government at all. But they now have a leader, a fake president who gives them fake hope.
Okay, good. We see it that way too. Okay, thank you.
Can I think of something?
Guns was part of
Pardon me?
Can I think